The city on the Neva was never just a point on a map. Leningrad was the symbolic heartland of the revolution, the former imperial capital reborn as a Soviet metropolis. The proud name of Lenin carried into stone and steel, and the forward bastion of the Baltic fleet on the cold sea to the west. To Berlin's planners, seizing or erasing Leningrad promised a shattering blow, militarily, by cutting a major industrial hub and naval base. Politically, by humiliating the state that took its name from the city's founding myth. And psychologically, by discrediting the idea of Soviet endurance before all Europe. As Army Group North turned east in the summer heat of 1941, the city's fate became an objective wrapped in ideology. Break the factories, break the fleet, break the story of 1917 itself. The strategic logic was stark. Leningrad anchored the northern arc of the Soviet defense, with rail junctions that threaded men and materiel to the front and docks that supported operations across the Baltic. Its industries, armaments, shipbuilding, machine tools were not merely statistics. They were the backbone of Panzer's opposition and the lungs of a vast war economy under strain. For the invaders, cutting Leningrad away from the Soviet interior would free German forces and Finnish allies to consolidate the Baltic, compress the Soviet line, and turn pressure toward Moscow with a secured northern flank. Operation Barbarossa opened on June 22, 1941, and the northern axis moved quickly through the Baltic states toward the Luga line and on to the rail nodes that fed Leningrad's lifelines. But speed met resistance. The Luga defensive slowed the average German advance to a crawl as Red Army formations and newly scraped-together units traded space for time, buying critical weeks for the city's administrators to organize defenses and evacuations. Each day one on the approaches allowed more civilians to be moved, more guns dug in, and more factories stripped or repurposed under a summons that reached every able hand. By late August, the ring drew tight. The fall of Engau on August 29th severed the last rail link to the Soviet hinterland, and the capture of Schlisselburg on September 8th sealed the land corridor entirely. That date, September 8, 1941, stands as the formal beginning of the siege, a blockade that would last 872 days until January 27, 1944. To the north, Finnish forces pressed down. To the south and west, German formations built a wall of guns and earthworks. To the east lay Lake Ladoga, an icy artery that would become, in time, the road of life. Inside the city, urgency hardened into a system. Mobilization orders swept through neighborhoods. Factory whistles became battle calls, and shop floors became training grounds as workers joined hastily organized companies to fill gaps. Along a defensive belt carved through suburbs and parks, women, teenagers, and retirees moved timber, poured concrete, and stacked sandbags, while artillery units were sighted to cover likely avenues of approach and to answer incoming shells with counter-battery fire. Every bridge, boulevard, and courtyard was measured not for beauty, but for fields of fire. Every pile of rubble, a ready barricade. Every cellar, a shelter or a supply cache. The first bombardments tested this improvised fortress. Warehouses burned, depots cracked, and rail yards twisted under high explosive, while daylight raids sought to terrorize and to disorganize the flow of men and materials. Yet the shock of those strikes did not scatter the defense. It clarified it. Medical stations were dispersed, command posts relocated, and redundant lines of communication strung through basements and tunnels. The Baltic Fleet's guns, pulled into the defense, added a deep base to the city's answer, throwing steel back toward the batteries on the outskirts as anti-aircraft crews learned the rhythms of alarm and silence. Even as the ring closed, the calculus of survival began. Evacuation trains had rolled until the last rails were cut. After that, smaller groups attempted escape by water or made ready for winter when the lake would harden. Authorities inventoried grain, fuel, and medicines, projecting rations under scenarios none of them wished to accept as lasting reality. The population inside the city, workers, soldiers, families, the elderly, became both the garrison and the heart of the story, their daily decisions as consequential as any staff order. For Army Group North, the directive from the top was ruthless. Leningrad was not to be bargained with or administered only starved, broken, removed from the ledger of living cities. The blockade would replace assault, logistics would replace shock, and hunger would do what shells could not, while pressure elsewhere sought to hold Soviet reserves in place. Yet each week, the city altered that balance. Time is a front in war, and Leningrad's time, measured in rations and in courage, began to impose costs on the besiegers. Picture the map as the camera pans. Arcs of artillery to the south and west, finish lines to the north, the thin blue of Lake Ladoga to the east, with arrows indicating barges in fair weather, and a dotted line presaging the winter road to come. Cut to street-level frames, trenches cut across avenues, anti-tank obstacles sprouting in squares, workers hauling timbers past statues shrouded against shrapnel, and students in greatcoats drilling with rifles in the shadow of factories whose smokestacks still rise. The narration's cadence should match the image's gravity. Dates stamped subtly on the lower third, June 22nd, August 29th, September 8th, and a counter that will later tick to 872 days, anchoring viewers in the scale of what begins here. In those first months, the city did not present the drama of a stormed fortress. It presented the tension of a vice, tightening by the day, the terrible quiet between alarms, and the relentless work of turning a metropolis into a redoubt. This is the prologue not just to deprivation, but to defiance, the decision to stand, to organize, to fight for time, and for the chance that a distant front will shift, that a convoy will arrive, that winter can be survived. By the time the lake freezes and the road of life is sketched across black ice under hostile skies, Leningrad will already have shown what it is. A city that refuses to be a victory parade ground, a city that insists on living. They called it the Road of Life, a name as practical as it was poetic. When the land ring closed around Leningrad, the city's only open door lay to the east, across the cold expanse of Lake Ladoga. In summer, barges and small craft slipped over gray water. In winter, when the lake hardened into black glass, trucks crept across a marked corridor of ice under hostile skies. This was not a miracle. It was a machine built from urgency. Port works hastily fortified, ice routes surveyed and resurveyed, and a choreography of men and women who measured survival by tonnage and time. The logic of Ladoga was born from Blockade. With rail and road severed, even minimal subsistence required thousands of tons each week, flour and grain for bread, coal and wood for heat, fuel and munitions for defense. Airlift could not carry such burdens. Capacity, weather, and enemy fire made it a supplement at best. So the lake became a supply artery, one that changed with the seasons and demanded adaptation at every turn. Piers dredged and reinforced, depots pushed forward and dispersed, and schedules written to the rhythm of weather reports and reconnaissance. In autumn 1941, the first barges nosed into Asinovets on the western shore, grain sacks stacked to the gunwales, their passage shielded as best as possible by patrols and the Ladoga flotilla. From the lakeside, a short rail spur and convoys moved the loads into the city, where flour became ration bread and fuel kept a skeleton grid alive. Every landing was a race unload before the next raid, clear the quay before the sirens, spread stockpiles, so one bomb could not erase a week's hope. Winter changed the stage without easing the danger. As the surface thickened, surveyors marched ahead with poles and augers, testing ice, plotting weight limits, and hammering in laths to mark safe lanes. The first sleds went out, then light vehicles, then trucks assigned by load class to specific corridors, each with spacing rules to prevent resonance and sudden breaks. Night operations became the norm. Headlights hooded, engines idled low at halts, drivers trained to read pale stakes and dark horizons while listening for the percussive pop of cracking ice or the distant growl of bombers. Technical improvisation kept the route alive. Engineering teams scraped and rolled fresh snow for traction, laid brush where glare ice was treacherous, and cut drainage slots so meltwater would not pool and refreeze into lethal slicks. Anti-aircraft guns were emplaced on shorelines and in some sectors on the ice itself. Machine gun nests and ski patrols watched for raiders, while repair crews stood ready with planks and ropes for vehicles that hit slush pockets. When shells walked their way across the lanes, Convoys scattered to alternate marks. Discipline and training, the only barrier between order and disaster. Losses were the road's tax. In the early weeks of operation, before the ice settled to safe thickness, dozens of trucks punched through and vanished, swallowed in seconds by the lake's black mouth. Even at maturity, the route took lives, a tire off the mark, a driver misreading stakes in ground fog, a string of bombs forcing a sudden turn into thin ice. The calculus never changed. Each ton delivered kept the city breathing. Each vehicle returned made space for a child, a wounded soldier, an elderly woman bundled under blankets against the killing wind. Evacuation moved with the same grim efficiency. Priority lists governed seats. Children, the ill, the elderly, those most at risk of starvation or exposure. Many rode on open trucks, faces wrapped in scarves, knees knocking from cold as the convoy shuddered over cracks that sang like glass. Some never reached the far shore, struck by strafing runs, or simply overtaken by the elements. But hundreds of thousands did, a tide moving out as supplies flowed in, the lake bearing both sorrow and relief. Inside Leningrad, the road of life translated into calories and degrees. Flour meant rations could rise from starvation minima to survivable levels. Coal and wood meant stoves could burn long enough to keep rooms above freezing. Fuel brought ambulances and water pumps back to life, while munitions kept the city's guns speaking in reply. Industrial inputs, spare parts, oils, and alloys allowed machine shops to repair and produce under siege conditions, a stubborn heartbeat beneath the sirens. Coordination bridged military and civilian spheres. Naval patrols and the Ladoga flotilla provided security and routing. Air defense units learned to layer fire over convoy windows. Logistics officers balanced inbound food against outbound evacuees and cultural treasures, paintings, archives, and machinery that could not be replaced. Civil administrators synchronized ration cycles with convoy arrivals, spreading the gains to blunt the shock of disruptions when weather or attacks choked the lanes. The system was not smooth, but it was resilient, able to bend under blows that would have shattered a less prepared network. Show it visually. Frames of trucks advancing across wind-polished ice, their shadows long in the pale sun, followed by barges low in the water when thaw returns. Cut to maintenance crews, wiring stakes, and tamping snow into ruts. Then to columns of evacuees at lakeside, children clutching bundles, medics lifting stretchers onto flatbeds. Interleave maps that trace the corridor's arc and simple callouts in the lower third. Road of life, night convoy, evacuations, to orient the eye while the story carries the weight. No one mistook Ladoga for safety. Bombs fell, shells landed, ice cracked. The wind could flay a face raw in minutes. Yet by turning a lake into a highway and a highway into a lifeline, the city won what it needed most time. Day after day, ton after ton, person after person, the road of life kept Leningrad connected to the world beyond the guns, allowing the besieged to hold out through the worst winter and into a future where relief would come not by water or ice, but by the breaking of the ring itself. Hunger did not arrive as a single blow. It descended in measured cuts, formalized in tables and stamps. The ration book became the most valuable object in Leningrad, a passport to survival that could not guarantee life. By November 20th, 1941, rations had fallen to their lowest point, 250 grams of bread per day for manual workers and 125 grams for dependents and most civilians, with quality so poor that the loaves were stretched with cellulose, husks, and fillers that blunted hunger without feeding the body. These numbers were not abstract. They translated to roughly 460 calories on paper for some categories, and often less in reality when supply disruptions meant full allocations never arrived. The city learned to count differently. A meal was slices, not portions. A day was a queue, not a calendar. Families negotiated fractional shares with the precision of watchmakers, shaving crusts to save a sliver for nightfall, dissolving bread in hot water to trick the stomach, scouring recipes that had never been written for nutrition but for endurance. Work brigades prioritized heavy labor and the front with slightly higher rations. But the gap between categories could not overcome the abyss of scarcity. Children over 12 fell into adult quotas without adult bodies to bear the shock, and the very young shrank in silence, the city's future traded for the city's present. Then came the winter. The temperature fell to brutal lows -30 degrees on some days, and with it, the city's systems failed in series. Electricity dwindled to a fraction of pre-war levels. Heating collapsed. Water and sewage froze in the pipes, forcing residents to chip ice from canals and courtyards while carrying it home on sleds or makeshift stretchers. Public transport halted, leaving miles of trudging over ice-slick streets for rations that might already be gone when a shivering line reached the kiosk. The cold punished every task, a tax on movement and breath and will, while shells and bombs turned every errand into a wager on chance. Mortality rose like a tide and peaked in January and February 1942, when upward of 100,000 people per month succumbed, most to starvation, many to exposure and illness, magnified by malnutrition. The visible city changed. Figures moved more slowly, shoulders arched against a wind that seemed to cut through cloth and skin. Sleds scraped along with water cans, firewood, or sometimes a covered body headed toward an overburdened cemetery. Funerals shrank to hurried rituals under bombardment, or to no ritual at all when the ground hardened beyond the reach of shovels, forcing mass graves and delayed burials. The civic pact included silence and stoicism, mourning folded inward because there was no strength to spend on grief that could not be finished. Scarcity eroded order at the edges. Cards for bread became targets for theft and murder, shifting the city's moral axis under pressure no community ought to bear. The archives and later publications documented cases of cannibalism in the winter of 1941-42, investigated, categorized by law, and harshly punished by the authorities. But such cases, however horrifying, remained a small fraction amid the broader catastrophe of hunger deaths. The more common crimes were quieter: a ration card torn from a mittened hand, a sack snatched and vanishing into an alley, a ledger altered under dim light by a clerk desperate to keep a family alive another week. The state's response mixed policing and propaganda with the practical work of keeping distributions running at all, because a halted queue could become a riot, and a riot could become an end. Within homes, survival reorganized life. Stoves, iron Berzoika heaters, and improvised contraptions alike became the household's heart. Fed by furniture, books, door frames, anything that would burn long enough to warm a room and boil thin soup. Windows were taped, internal partitions erected from scavenged boards to create smaller spaces that a weak fire might heat. Work crews in apartments layered blankets over doors and sealed cracks with rags. Neighbors pooled fuel and took turns keeping watch over the embers, trading the night's worst hours so the others could sleep. Even speech grew economical. Words cost warmth. The bread itself became a character in the city's drama. Baked from flour mixed with fillers to stretch stockpiles, it crumbled differently, tasted of wood or bitter hulls, stuck in the throat unless crumbled into water. Survivors later spoke of that bread as both salvation and indictment, the thing that kept the heart beating, and a daily witness to what had been taken away. Lines formed before dawn outside bakeries and distribution points, bodies pressed together for heat, eyes on the scales, the clerk's knife, the official stamp that transubstantiated paper into food. When a ration rose, even slightly, faces lifted. When it fell or failed, people learned again how much a number can weigh. Institutions adapted with a grim professionalism. Hospitals triaged by survivability under conditions that mocked the word. Schools became shelters and kitchens when lessons could not be justified against hunger. Museums guarded canvases in basements, while their staff counted calories like curators of time. The administration synchronized distribution with convoy cycles from the lake, smoothing peaks and troughs to prevent collapses when weather or attack cut the road of life. Factories, where possible, aligned shifts with ration windows and handed out hot water or thin kasha to workers who could not stand without it. Because a line that fell meant the front line elsewhere might also fall, and still, small defiances survived. A violin played in a cold room, a poem copied by hand, a loaf shared in extra thin slices because someone had farther to walk. There were moments of organized uplift, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra wrestling Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony into the air in August 1942 under supply and security arrangements that were themselves feats of logistics. But those belong to another chapter. Here, in the winter of 1941-42, endurance wore a quieter face. Stove smoke at dawn, the creak of a sled runner, the stamp of a ration card, the click of a lock over a loaf wrapped in cloth. Hunger ruled that winter, but it did not have the last word. The road of life thickened with traffic. Rations crept upward from the absolute floor, and the city learned to breathe again shallowly, painfully, but enough to see beyond the coldest months. The price paid can be counted in statistics, but it is better seen in the images, the faces in those lines, the hands on those sleds, the loaves on those scales, each a ledger entry in a civic will that refused to break. Liberation did not descend on Leningrad as a sudden light. It emerged from months of tightening Soviet pressure along the front in a decisive decision to break the siege, not merely endure it. In January 1944, the Red Army launched a coordinated offensive driven by the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, with support from the Second Baltic Front aimed at pushing Army Group North away from the city and restoring overland lifelines once and for all. The plan married artillery mass, improved winter mobility, and hard-won tactical experience from Stalingrad and Kursk, translating the city's time-bought endurance into battlefield maneuver. The first blows fell on January 14, 1944. Within days, the Red Army ruptured key German positions and drove toward the vital rail and road corridors that had starved the city for nearly 2.5 years. Unga called by the Germans, the eastern lock of the siege fell back into Soviet hands, and with it, the long-severed Moscow-Leningrad Railway was restored, a logistical artery that signified more than transport. It signified the end of isolation. German formations that had once dictated the city's fate now yielded ground, abandoning strong points as Soviet infantry and armor pressed them west across frozen rivers and fields. On January 27, 1944, the city received what it had earned at such great price, the full lifting of the blockade. A ceremonial 324-gun salute cracked through the winter air as crowds embraced and wept. Joy braided with grief for those who would not see the spring. Fireworks and searchlights painted damaged facades, windows still boarded against blast, streets still scored by shrapnel, a city both battered and unbowed. In diaries and broadcasts, voices captured that night's impossible mixture, relief released in cheers and remembrance rising like breath in the cold. The offensive did not stop with the salute. Soviet forces continued to push Army Group North back 60 to 100 kilometers, clearing the approaches and anchoring a new defensive line to prevent any renewed encirclement. Strategic success had been paid for in blood. Soviet casualty figures ran high across the operation, but the goal had been achieved. The siege, after 872 days, was broken. What began as a held mission in 1941 ended as an assertive restoration of connection. The city reintegrated into the Soviet war economy and the broader Allied effort on the Eastern Front. Counting the cost is a moral as well as historical act. Civilian death toll estimates reach into the 7 figures, with the majority attributed to starvation and cold rather than bombs or shells. A grim ledger that defines the siege as much as any map. Entire neighborhoods bore scars, apartment blocks hollowed by fire, schools and hospitals repaired while still in use. Factories that had worked through the siege now retooled for advance instead of endurance. The population, once nearing 3 million, had been transformed. More than 1.5 million had been evacuated over the course of the blockade, and hundreds of thousands never returned. Memory found a ground to stand on in the months and years that followed. Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery became the city's quiet heart of mourning, with mass graves holding hundreds of thousands of civilians alongside tens of thousands of soldiers, a place where numbers meet names and where the silence speaks. Monuments, plaques, and preserved sites of defense gun emplacements, fortifications, and the marked arc of the siege lines turned the metropolis into a living archive. Each corner a footnote to an experience that defies adequate explanation. Annual commemorations on January 27th keep the story in public time, not only as pride, but as warning and remembrance. For Leningrad, liberation meant transition from survival under siege to recovery in war. Supply trains arriving over reconnected rails fed more than people. They fed reconstruction plans, refitted factories, and restored normal rhythms of work and rest that war had mangled. The Baltic Fleet's contribution shifted from local defense back to broader naval tasks. Even as coastal batteries stayed ready, a habit formed by necessity. The city's cultural life kept flickering through the darkest months expanded as theaters reopened. Orchestras played to full halls, and museums raised artworks from basements to walls again. Close at Piskaryovskoye, walk the long lines of the burial mounds, the solemn sculptures, the eternal flame, where present and past share a breath. The narration's tone should descend to quiet at the cemetery, acknowledging the ledger that cannot be paid back, only carried forward as duty. What Leningrad proved in the end was not invulnerability, but persistence. The city had been a battlefield and a home at once, a workshop and a redoubt, a place where ordinary people did extraordinary things for longer than seemed possible. Liberation recognized that record. Memory sustains it. And as the trains ran again and the lights came back, the lesson that remained was written in the faces that had endured. That survival is a civic achievement as profound as victory, and that a city can be a promise kept by its people